All the numbers are going down. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. Podcast downloads and audiences both fell 10% last month, according to Podtrac's rankers for September. iHeart Podcasts is still number one for podcast publishers. Wondery is still the number one sales network, and The Daily is still the number one podcast. Podtrac measures participating publishers only. Amazon has closed its streaming radio service, AMP. The service launched in March last year and reportedly fired half its staff 12 months ago. Podcast production tool Podcastle has launched Magic Dust AI, a generative AI tool that enhances podcast creation. It includes a studio-quality sound tool and a cinematic blur feature for video. TechCrunch covers the launch, claiming that the company has a user base of more than 1 million. Melon Media, a podcast production company in Greece, released the first survey into Greek podcast listeners last year. It suggested that podcasts in Greece is a relatively recent phenomenon, with only 8% of respondents who've been listening for more than 2 years. We missed that data when it was first released, but it's still helpful even now. Auphonic has launched a new automatic filler word cutter. It's been trained for 4 languages, but you can help it test on more. Spotted on Hacker News, a new service called Grow, 2Rs, which promises AI-powered and actionable cross-promo recommendations tailored for your podcast. Recommendations will always be free, it says. Patreon has a new logo along with a set of new features. Acast has been announced as the major partner for the Paris Podcast Festival next week. Now, we're not sure why you'd want to host your podcast on Spotify for podcasters without wanting to be listed on Spotify itself, but from November the 6th, that won't be possible, says Spotify, notifying Spotify for podcasters' users that their show will automatically be distributed on Spotify from that date. The New York Festival's Radio Awards are open for entries from anywhere. There are a set of new categories, including sci-fi, fantasy and horror, and mystery, with plenty of podcast categories to enter. The Canadian Podcast Awards are also open for entries. More than 600 podcasts were submitted last year for the awards, which are open to Canadian shows. In the Netherlands, the NHL Stenden University of Applied Sciences is to start a course on the business of podcasting. The PodPro's actively established podcast report has been updated for October. It reports more active shows. Captivate is the new number 1 ranked podcast host. Spotify has announced a new set of podcasters that have been selected for the company's Radar Emerging Talent program. There are 5 podcasters selected from France, Italy, Spain and the US, and 3 from Australia. And Michael Geist, a law professor at the University of Ottawa, writes about the CRTC's registration requirements for podcast services, criticising the media regulator's process and concluding that it did not want to give Canadians a reasonable opportunity to have their say. He's also written a decent explainer about it, which we'll link to today from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Meanwhile, Canadaland's Jessie Brown is concerned. What they're signalling is, we're going to be regulating the space, but we're not telling you how. That makes it very hard, he told Canada's CBC. And in podcast news, gosh, we've got a lot to get through. We've got the AI and digital transformation podcast, Ice Cream, a fiction horror series from 911 podcast, which is celebrating its 1-year anniversary with 100,000 global downloads. Were You Raised by Wolves? We'll be doing a live show at the New York Comedy Festival on November the 8th. More details in our show notes and our newsletter. The Deep Dive with Jessica Sinclair and June Diane Raphael has joined Lemonada Media. The show was with Earwolf. A new episode is out today. Born Greek, Made American is new from Melon Media, a podcast production company in Athens in Greece. It focuses on a long line of adopted Greek children by US couples that has been kept a secret for years. It's a story that takes us back to the Cold War years and a story about broken families. All episodes are out today. Also, Season 8 of Heavyweight is out today. Don't Call Me Resilient launched Season 6 last week. It's your weekly dose of the news from an anti-racist perspective. And the 3rd season of Sound Judgment also launched last week. Plenty more details in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.